Good evening. Welcome to this final Exploring Research seminar in our autumn series, considering the source of Elizabeth Blackwell's A Curious Herbal by Janet Tyson. Thank you for joining us live today. My name is Julia Nurse. I'm a Research Development Specialist here at Wellcome Collection and currently run this programme of seminars. For those of you who cannot see the screen, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing dark-framed glasses and a green top with a scarf because it's a bit chilly. And I'm currently sitting in my dining room, and there's a piano and a poster of a sun and an owl behind me, and a painting also of the sun, and a nice Christmas candle burning in the background. As the title of this series suggests, these seminars explore current research that relates to our collections around topics that touch on how we think and feel about health. In the autumn programme, we focus on themes covering the medieval to early modern periods. For previous seminars we've delivered in the programme, please see the Wellcome Collection events page on our website, and I think you'll find a link to this in the chat. Our spring programme will feature speakers that cover material from the 19th century to today. And more details about this will be advertised throughout our research networks in due course, and there will be a slide advertising what's coming later at the end of this presentation. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I just want to flag some general housekeeping rules. This session will run for an hour. Janet will share a presentation with us for around 40 minutes. After which there will be an opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A. Please post your questions here, although you can also make comments, and feel free to post those in the general chat as well. All names will be anonymised in the recording. I'll facilitate the questions at the end, and if Janet doesn't have time to answer them all, don't worry, we'll send them on to her and she will attempt to respond to these in due course. Please also note, as I mentioned, that this session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent out via Eventbrite after the event. So if you lose connection at any time, hopefully that won't happen, but if you do, you can rejoin the link, just exit and rejoin the link, rejoin using the link that was provided in the email earlier. We'll also post this link on our Wellcome Collection Researchers Network page on Facebook after the event if you're a member. If you're not a member, then please do join. Throughout this network, we distribute information about our activities like these seminars. So should you need to use them, please select closed captions. These can be done by clicking on the bottom right hand of the screen. If there's any other way that we can improve accessibility to these seminars, please do tell us. A brief feedback questionnaire will be sent out with the recording link after the event, where you can tell us what you think about tonight, and this will also be available in the chat at the end of the session. Please do take time to fill this in, just to let us know how we're doing and how we might improve them in the future, and really what other research we could be covering in this programme. So now to introduce our speaker today, Janet Tyson, who will discuss the sources behind Elizabeth Blackwell's Herbal, which was published in the mid-18th century, the first to be produced by a woman. Janet and I share a common background. We both come from art history backgrounds. We're both particularly fascinated in printing technologies, and we're also both drawn to the illustrative impact of the herbal, which had been a source of knowledge on materia medica for those involved in healing since medieval times. We are also both fascinated in the role of women in early modern medicine. Janet is currently a PhD candidate in early modern history at Birkbeck, University of London. Her research addresses the social and bibliographic history of Blackwell's Herbal. She recently worked as the 2020 researcher in residence of the Oak Spring Garden Foundation in the States, where she studied their 2 copies of Blackwell's Herbal in the library there. Prior to entering into research at Birkbeck, Janet took master's degrees in both art history and printmaking. She's also studied librarianship. In today's seminar, she will provide a brief critique of what has been written about Blackwell and will also give a comparative analysis of Wellcome Collection's own copy of A Curious Herbal. Please welcome Janet Tyson.
Thank you, Julia. Good evening, all, and thanks too to the Wellcome Collection for this opportunity to share some of my research findings. For attendees who do not see me, I'm a 67-year-old white woman with chin-length, mostly white hair. I'm wearing a blue jumper. I use the pronouns she and her, but I don't really spend a lot of time thinking of myself as a female. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm an American. I was born in the state of Michigan and have a house there, but for the past 3 years, I've been sharing a house with a colleague and good friend down in Dorset, which is just wonderful. There's a work of embroidered textile art on the wall behind me, as well as a lacquered tray. And I hope that this room is lighted well enough that you'll be able to see some images that I have here with me tonight that I would like to also share. My presentation will address certain aspects of my thesis, which overall concerns a particular book as both a material artifact and as a document of 18th century London society and culture. That dual awareness reflects my background in studio art. I have an MFA in printmaking and my master's degree in art history. The book that I'm addressing is A Curious Herbal, containing 500 cuts of the most useful plants which are now used in the practice of physic. I've examined more than 60 copies of the herbal in libraries in the UK and United States. Most of that fieldwork was funded by a Catherine F. Panzer Junior Fellowship, from the Bibliographical Society of America, as well as a library scholarship from the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, which Julia also already mentioned. In addition to the book's title and these 2 pages in the slide shown here, also feature the name of Elizabeth Blackwell and indicate that it was she who produced the book. Very little is known about Elizabeth, but for the past 250 or so years, her life story has been a sort of construction project for a number and variety of writers. Some of you may already be familiar with a range of those accounts. However, I'm more interested in what Blackwell's herbal say about itself and about her. So I'm beginning with these title pages. The inscriptions that they bear provide further description of the book's contents, and they note in particular that the 2 volumes contain a total of 500 images of plants, images that were printed from folio-size copper plates. It's possible, maybe not too easy though, to see the faint plate impression in the upper left-hand corner of the slide at the left, or the title page rather, at the left. But what probably isn't very visible is in those plate impressions, is that the copper plates measured about 12 by 8 inches, or roughly 30.5 by 20 centimeters, vertically and horizontally. Those dimensions were, as stated on these title pages, folio size, and a folio book reflects prestige. The herbal's prestige was also communicated by the elegant and understated graphic design of these pages, the style that book historian Bertrand Bronson calls inscriptional tablet. The letter forms on both pages were engraved in a mix of cursive, Roman, and italic letters. Every element in A Curious Herbal, illustrations and words, were created from intaglio matrices, that is, plates that had been engraved and or etched. This contrasts with the overwhelming majority of books in which text was printed from letterpress matrices. A Curious Herbal is one of just, I think, a handful of books that were produced using the intaglio process throughout, at least during that period, and I imagine since that time as well. Intaglio lines, the lines that you see there, are printed from incisions that contain ink. Letterpress is a form of relief printing, so what you see is printed from raised areas that have been inked. Then at the bottom of each title page is information about the booksellers who distributed the work. Samuel Harding of St. Martin's Lane was one, and John Norse at the Sign of the Lamb without Temple Bar was the second distributor, Blackwell's second bookseller. The title page for the first volume is from a copy of the Herbal at the New York Public Library. It has the same date, 1751, as the copy from the Wellcome Collection. I'm using this New York slide only because the pre-COVID photograph that I took of the Wellcome copy was of poor quality, and I didn't have a chance due to the virus to get back to London to take a better picture. But the title page for Volume 2 is from the Wellcome copy. For those of you who aren't familiar with A Curious Herbal, excuse me, here is some contextual information. The narrative, as it were, is set in London during the early to mid-18th century. The central character is Elizabeth Blackwell, whose birth date and place are not authoritatively known. Excuse me. That said, however, she firmly has been identified as the wife of a Scottish immigrant to London named Alexander Blackwell. Alexander was a rather reckless man. After a few years in London, he was sued by a printer there for having practiced printing without serving an apprenticeship. He was sued, he went into debt, and it is generally agreed that Elizabeth produced the herbal to sell on his behalf to offset his debts. Support for Elizabeth's project came from several prominent botanists and medical men in London. Probably Sir Hans Sloane and Dr. Richard Mead are the best known names of them. Over a period of over 3 years, Elizabeth drew and etched all 500 of the botanical images found in copies of the book. She did not engrave them, and that is erroneously stated on the title pages and is frequently claimed in much of the writing about her and about the herbal. We'll have a chance perhaps in a few minutes to talk more about the differences between engraving and etching, the processes, as well as the visual differences. In many cases, in many copies of the book, Elizabeth also supplied hand coloring of images of plants. Curious Herbal was the first herbal produced by a woman, but in its time, what was noted about the herbal was the quantity and quality of its visual and verbal information. In other words, yes, there was recognition that Elizabeth, a woman, had made the book, but it was really distinguished by what it contained, by its contents. Overall, I've approached the herbal as a collaboration between Blackwell and networks of known and unknown actors, primarily in London's botanical and book-centered communities. But I also am addressing book buyers, owners of copies of the herbal. They are what I think of as post-production participants in that collaboration. With respect to today's presentation, though, there are countless questions that could be raised, but I want to focus on just two for now. One being, where did Blackwell obtain the visual and verbal information that she put into A Curious Herbal? And how did she choose to present and represent that information? Effectively, all of the print sources that Elizabeth consulted are held by the Wellcome Collection. The coronavirus has made it difficult to access some of those materials, which I had hoped to photograph for this presentation, but happily Many of those print sources are available, or really almost they all are available online. Not always the best quality, but they are available online, and they include a key book belonging to the Wellcome. I also have a handful of photographs that I made during pre-COVID visits to the Wellcome Collection, but my most cherished sources for today's presentation are going to be coming up just a little bit later on. So let's see, slide 3. There we are. Okay, so pictured on this slide are title pages of the 3 key sources for A Curious Herbal, and left to right, they are presented in chronological order. At the left is the title page for Volume 1 of the 12-volume Hortus Malabaricus, or Malabar Garden, which was published between 1678 and 1663. The Wellcome owns 11 of the 12 copies, but rather frustratingly for my purposes, not Volume 1. But we will consider that source in general more closely toward the end of my presentation. At the center is the title page of the 1721 edition of the Dispensary of the Royal College of Physicians of London. The dispensatory was written by the physician John Quincy, who served during Hans Sloane's tenure as RCP president. This is not the first edition of the dispensatory. That was published in 1618, 60 years prior even to production of the Hortus Malabaricus. Excuse me. But as I'll discuss momentarily, it was the dispensatory's up-to-date 1721 edition that served as the foundational text for A Curious Herbal. Then at the far right is the title page of apothecary Joseph Miller's herbal called the Botanicum Officinale. It was published in 1722, 1 year after that edition of the dispensatory. At the time of Blackwell's activities, Joseph Miller was the master of the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries, which maintain not only an impressive meeting hall and laboratory in central London, but also managed the Chelsea Physic Garden. And the apothecaries also traditionally had provided ingredients for treatments that were prescribed by members of the Royal College of Physicians. Now, as I indicated a minute ago, it was the most up-to-date edition of the dispensatory that provided Blackwell with her initial list of most of the plants that she would include in A Curious Herbal. The manuscript on the left-hand side of this screen, little pattywampus here. The caption for the British Library manuscript, the information is low in the slide. It's not showing on the screen, so some information about that manuscript, which is in the Sloane Manuscripts Collection, is not available to viewers. But in any case, the letter at the left is a letter of introduction that was written for Elizabeth to present to Hans Sloane. It was written by Sloane's fellow physician and former protege, Alexander Stewart. By way of introducing Blackwell to Sloane, Stewart mentioned that 2 of Elizabeth's kin were known to Sloane. This sharing, establishing a shared acquaintance, such as this, was a conventional means of confirming at that time that the person being introduced was a reliable quantity. It was just all part and parcel of a whole series of negotiations that could take place socially that were facilitated through letter writing to a great extent. even more so than face-to-face meetings, that allowed people to share knowledge and to expand their network of acquaintances and knowledgeable acquaintances. Stewart also described Mrs. Blackwell, in quotes, as, quote, a very ingenious person who drew the specimens of the dispensatory plants which you have seen, of which she designs to complete the whole set to about 500. So Sloane had already seen Blackwell's drawings of the dispensatory plants, and now she was planning on making etchings from those drawings. The letter that I'm referring to is held by the Sloane Manuscripts Archive at the BL. And to my knowledge, this presentation, this Wellcome presentation, is the first time that that document has been published, or at least the first time it has been published in reference to Elizabeth Blackwell. Both of the kin referenced in that letter were English, which supports my own opinion that Elizabeth Blackwell was a Londoner, not, as most sources have claimed, a native of Aberdeen. I'm willing to elaborate on that point a little later on if anyone has any questions or comments on that matter, but for now, my focus is on the letter's allusions to Blackwell sourcing the dispensatory's list of simples, which is to say, individual plants. As noted on the title page, this edition of this dispensatory was prepared by the physician John Quincy, and he was basically allied with goals set by Hans Sloane, whose tenure as the president of the RCP extended from 1719 to 1735. Now, here in slide 5, these are pages from the preface of the dispensatory, and they reflect Sloane's and Quincy's determination to purge physic, or medicine, of superstition and quackery. The highlighted areas, which I hope are legible, are particularly salient. So what I'm suggesting then is that the herbal also reflected a modernizing term, even as it occasionally cited traditional classical approaches to physic that included Galen's use of herbalism in relation to bodily humors. For example, the text here states that the Catalogue of Simples, which was collated toward the end of this volume, was, quote, entirely new as to its method, end quote. For one thing, the catalog accounted for various names by which plants were known, so that names could be cross-referenced and plants clearly identified. The text continued, quote, we have thrown out all those things which owed their rise to superstition and a false philosophy, and endeavored as far as the nature of such things could admit to reduce all to the test of reason and experience, end quote. In this context, experience meant experiment, testing. So reason and experimentation, both of which reflected the tenets of empiricism, were mobilized here. Notably, the number of plants listed in the RCP book exceeded the 500 that Blackwell illustrated. So that indicates that she made choices about what to use and what not to use, and some of those choices do seem a bit mystifying. For example, Blackwell did not include allium or garlic in the herbal, which and allium is in the dispensatory, but she did include a debunked item known as the Scythian or vegetable lamb, a specimen of which is actually displayed at the Museum of Natural History. In any case, the number of plants listed in the dispensatory's catalog also exceeded the more than 620 that were included in Joseph Miller's book. And that can be seen as, at least I see it as a sort of intermediary between the content of the dispensatory and A Curious Herbal. So the dispensatory contained no illustrations, and neither did Miller's Botanicum. Now, okay, this slide shows the listings for 2 plants from the dispensatory's catalog of simples. These are the officinal simples. derived from plants. Other simples were derived from mineral and animal sources, but these are just the plants. And the two that I'm referring to are Ananas or Ananas or rest harrow and Fumaria or fumitory. Both of those plants are found in Miller's text and in Blackwell's book. I have the actual pages here, but it's not going to work to show them in tandem with the slides. So we can pause the slides and I'll focus on the pages. Now, I mentioned rest harrow. I'm sure these are showing up. Okay. How well this is coming across. But this is a plate showing rest harrow, and it's a huge root, and then the foliage and the flowers are relatively small, as can be seen. And getting this up closer at the bottom of the page, you can be seen the printing at the bottom, which gives the name of the plant, and it gives Elizabeth Blackwell's name. Likewise with Fumaria or fumitory, another plant with relatively modest foliage and tiny little flowers. And as far as I can tell, the flowers in rest harrow and the flowers for Fumaria both were painted with the same pinkish paint. And then, the root shown here as well. And then at the bottom, again, the information, and I hope that's coming across okay, with Blackwell's name. I bought both of those sheets in Palo Alto, California, about 25 years ago, or 35 years ago, actually, in an antique store. I was there on my lunch break, spotted them and bought them. I also acquired the Miller book, Joseph Miller's book, a few months ago. And I don't know how well this shows up, but here is the page on rest harrow. As you can see, it's a fairly lengthy description. It provides some of the same information that Blackwell provides, as we will see and hear. But Blackwell's entry requires considerably fewer words. Now, I'm going to just read the entry from Miller's book about rest harrow, and please excuse me, I hope this isn't going to take too long. The roots of rest harrow are very tough and woody, of a white color, running deep into the earth and sending out many shrubby twigs or branches. Now he's talking about the upper part of the plant. Smooth and tender at the first springing, but afterwards tough and full of long, sharp thorns, one growing at every setting on of the leaves, which grow several together at the joints, each being made of 3 parts like a trefoil and fastened to the stalk by a flat appendix. They are small, about half an inch long, and crenated about the edges. Among these, toward the tops of the branches, grow the flowers, which are papilionaceous, or like the flower of a pea, but less and flat, of a reddish purple color, growing hairy 5-pointed calices. After these are fallen come small flat pods, each containing 2 or 3 small kidney-like seeds. It grows in waste grounds and by roadsides, and is frequently among corn, flowering in June and July. And then he goes on to talk about, what the root is used for. Now, I'm going to just also read briefly from Elizabeth Blackwell's text. And here, and this may seem kind of egregious. But whoever broke out this book cut what are called the explanatory pages into little slices for each of the entries on the plates with which it was collated. So you can see it's pretty sparsely worded. Blackwell set this up as thusly: Plate 301, Rest Harrow, Ananas. 1. It grows about 3 foot high. The leaves are a deep grass green and the flowers a red purple. 2. It is found in waste grounds and frequently among corn, flowering in June and July. 3. The root is one of the 5 opening roots and is accounted good for the stoppage of urine, gravel, stone obstructions of the liver and spleen, the jaundice, and toothache. And then 4, she gives the different names of the plant in Latin, in Greek, Latin, Spanish, Italian, French, German, and Dutch. And likewise, Miller had said this root, which is one of the 5 opening roots, is the only part that is used, and is a good medicine against the stoppage of urine, gravel, and stone, to cleanse the vein, to cleanse the reins and ureters from tough, slimy humors. It opens obstruction of the liver and spleen and helps the jaundice. And then a decoction of it in vinegar and water, used as a gargle, helps the toothache from a defluxion of humors. And you might recognize that that is basically a Galenic reference, a classical medical reference. So Miller used 126 words to describe Rest Harrow, which Blackwell was able to summarize in her illustration and her succinct use of words. Likewise, she used just very few words to address where the plant grew, when it bloomed, and what it could be used for. The entry for fumitory is similar, and I'm not going to go into Miller's text for fumitory, but it's, in terms of length, but it is similar. And then Blackwell just basically says, Plate 237, fumitory, fumaria. 1, the stalk grows about 8 inches high. The leaves are a light green and the flower purple. 2, it grows in fields and tilled grounds, flowering in May. 3, this plant is accounted a great cleanser of the blood, being good for all sorts of cutaneous distempers and leprous disorders. It is much drank with whey in the spring to purge and purify ye blood and help ye scurvy, jaundice, and affections of the spleen. So just coincidentally, actually, from, as far as my collecting these pictures and texts, they seem to be useful for, dealing with similar internal organs and symptoms of, problems experienced in internal organs. So looking in terms of the wording and the pictures and comparing Miller to Blackwell, it's tempting to think of A Curious Herbal almost as an illustrated counterpart to Miller's book, which is purely verbal. But A Curious Herbal is really more than that. Its concise, list-like verbal references would have been much more user-friendly to lay readers than would have been Miller's text, which was oriented to medical professionals. So A Curious Herbal, in spite of being, a very large, heavy book to, move around and navigate one's way through, was a much more user-friendly text, a user-friendly reference, visually and with respect to its verbal articulation of information. So now we can go back to the slides, and I'll address those images momentarily. First, I want to note, as I sort of did already, that the 12th August 1735 date on Alexander Stuart's letter to Hans Sloane indicated that Elizabeth already was moving forward on her project. By October, she had gained the support. By October of that year, she had gained the support of most of the men whose names are recognized in various other pages in copies of the Herbal. Among those pages are 10 that bear dedications to men, 10 men, whom Blackwell considered particularly helpful. The dates of those dedications span mid-1737 through very early 1739. One of those dedications is shown at the right of this slide. It is to the man with whom we've become relatively familiar, Joseph Miller, and it bears a date rather late in the sequence, that is 1 December 1738. The earliest dedication was 14 July 1737 and was addressed to the wealthy and sociable physician Richard Mead. After Mead came Thomas Pellet, who was president of the RCP after Hans Sloane and was a close friend of Richard Mead's. Then after Thomas Pellet's dedication was one to our letter writer, Alexander Stuart, then one to Hans Sloane. Next came one to Robert Nichols, who was a distinguished apothecary who provided specimens for Blackwell to draw. And interestingly, he also left her some money in his will. Then there was Isaac Rand, a noted apothecary who arranged for Elizabeth to have access to plants from the Chelsea Physic Garden. Then James Douglas, a highly regarded surgeon. Then Henry Plumptre, a censor of the Royal College of Physicians. Then Joseph Miller, and lastly was a dedication to John Johnstone, a Glasgow physician who was Elizabeth's uncle by marriage. Now, in her full-page dedication to Miller, Elizabeth noted her use of his book as a source. She also wrote that he had furnished her with, quote, many fair samples of such physical plants as do not come to perfection with us. So, specimens, perhaps not fresh from the Physic Garden specimens, but specimens. Blackwell recognized Miller not only in the dedication at right, but also in the first explanatory page of the Herbals Volume 1, which is shown at left, and I've circled the top there. It's under the introduction. There is a total of 125 of these explanatory pages in A Curious Herbal. There's essentially one page of verbal information for every 4 pages of visual information provided in the Herbal. And if you look at this explanatory page, you can see just these sort of slices of text that are very clearly defined, and the references to the plates are very, very clearly defined. Typically, the explanatory page would precede then the grouping of 4 pages that bore images of plants. So in addition to providing that information through plates 1 through 4, Elizabeth introduces herself as the undertaker of the Herbal project. You know, she's saying that this is her work, which is incredibly important. She wrote that she was, quote, desirous to make this work more useful to such as are not furnished with other herbals, end quote. It's difficult to really work out precisely to whom she was gearing this book, because I think one would have to have been fairly affluent to afford it. So it would not have been to just ordinary buyers of, less expensive books that did not feature folio size plates. But, this was a book for, I think, by and large, non-specialists. In addition to making the work more useful to such as are not furnished with other herbals, she was intent upon giving a short description of each plant, identifying its place of growth and time of flowering, and citing its uses in physic, and also providing the ordinary names of the plants in different languages, which she did achieve all of those goals. Both of these pages bear charming headpieces or illustrations at the top. And these plates also were etched by Blackwell, but the wording on these pages was professionally sized by a specialist in engraving letter forms. This is very typical for that to be a specialty. People who engraved letter forms were not necessarily the people who were going to be engraving pictures. And this is the case with all the pages in the herbal that combine pictures and words. Now, these next two slides move on to more images, but from a different source entirely. The subject of the pictures is identified as Nux Vomica, which translates pretty much to what it sounds like, which is vomiting nuts. Vomiting nuts are listed in the Dispensary, and Miller addressed them in his book. Miller wrote of them rather dismissively, though, stating that they had no, quote, physical use, quote, end quote, apart from, quote, destroying cats and dogs, etc., end quote. Yes, did describe them, the seeds of the tree. Blackwell acknowledged Miller's conclusion, but she didn't stop there. Instead, she referred to other sources, writing that different parts of the tree from which Nux Vomica were taken possessed, quote, a great many virtues, end quote. I don't know if that source was a translation of the Latin text in which the Hortus Malabaricus was written. And that, again, would be the source of these pictures, of this picture here. The Hortus was not translated into English until the 20th century. It might be that Robert Nichols made the translation for her. Perhaps Joseph Miller did. It's just not known at this point. But Robert Nichols might have also had ideas that he could have shared with her. I'm thinking it might have been Nichols who either had the book or did a translation for Elizabeth, because he had a specimen of the actual nut, and he let her draw from it. She consulted it when she drew the picture that she made for A Curious Herbal. And we know this because in her entry for vomiting nuts, on explanatory page 99 of A Curious Herbal, Elizabeth wrote, quote, "This specimen I had from the Malabar Garden, volume 1, table 37, and the seed from Mr. Nichols." So the left of this slide shows table 37 in full. And what I've done is on the right-hand side, I've cropped it so that we can begin to focus in on the source of Elizabeth Blackwell's image for plate 395 from volume 2 of the Herbal. So you can see that there is a relationship between these images. Let's just imagine that Elizabeth had laid a piece of tracing paper over that cropped part of the image from the Hortus. She didn't quote it verbatim. She didn't trace it simply entirely as given. She created what you might want to think of as a visual paraphrase. Now, I don't have the software to manipulate the image to the extent that I would like. So what we need to imagine is that Elizabeth rotated the tracing paper slightly clockwise so that when she traced the branch, it, instead of growing out of the corner of the page, it came up out of the center of the bottom of the paper. Then imagine that she eliminated some of the elements, including the various scripts at the top, the leaf fragment in the lower left-hand corner, and one of the sliced pieces of fruit. And then she went and added the nut that Nichols had supplied, as well as noting the flower up in the upper left-hand corner. And obviously she colored it. What she would have done then, is she would have transferred her image from the tracing paper onto a wax-coated copper plate. Now, there are several different ways of effecting that transfer, so I don't really want to get into that just now. But after the image was transferred to the wax, she would have used an etching needle to draw back over those lines all the way down to the surface of the copper plate. So she's digging down through the wax to expose the surface of the copper plate. Now, from this point on, I'm thinking skilled laborers in the print shop would have taken over. For one of them, or maybe this was all accomplished by the same person, but somebody needed to immerse the plate into an acid bath so that the acid would bite into the exposed parts of the plate, into the parts of the plate that the etching needle had exposed. When this happened, the acid bit into the plate and effectively recreated Elizabeth's drawing in the form of incisions into the copper. Then the wax would be removed from the plate and it would be cleaned. Then ink would be dabbed onto the plate, and pushed down into the incisions. Then the surface of the plate was wiped clean, leaving only the ink in those grooves. And the ink in the grooves was what would produce the image. So the copper plate was placed face up on the felt-covered bed of a roller or rolling press. Paper was laid over the plate. Another blanket of felt was laid over that. And then this sandwich of inked metal, felt, and paper was rolled through the press. This rolling press could exert tremendous pressure on the paper, even pressure, such that the paper, which had been dampened, was forced into those incisions and into contact with the ink and pulled the ink back up out of those grooves. Now, when the imprint on the paper was viewed, it would be in reverse. So you can see this is the reversal of the image. It's flopped basically. And you can see how this then relates to the colored plate from A Curious Herbal. Now, my last slide, slide 10, provides an opportunity to compare, admittedly just one plate from the Wellcome copy, plate 70, Lily of the Valley, with three other, plates from three other copies of A Curious Herbal, Volume 1. I'm using these plates, not only for a bit of a comparison, but also to show how the same plant can be presented differently by different impressions that have been collated into different copies of the work. Lily of the Valley was addressed in both Miller's book and the Dispensatory. They both noted that the plant is of great service, quote, of great service in all disorders of the head and nerve, apoplexy, epilepsy, palsy, convulsions, and vertigo, and that it is much used in cephalic snuff. Both of these sources also noted that a large quantity of Lily of the Valley was used to make something called peony water, a recipe for which was found in the Dispensatory. But to return to Blackwell's illustrations, she etched the plate that provided the image, but again, the wording at the base of the plate was engraved by someone else. So in addition to identifying the plate by its common English and Latin names, the text gives the names of the parts that have been designated by engraved numbers in Blackwell's illustrations. Those parts are 1 flower, 2 berry, 3 seed. There's a number 4, the lackey, which refers to the caterpillar. Also engraved is the reference to, quote, Eliz Blackwell de Lynn sculpt et pinks. In other words, Elizabeth Blackwell drew, sculpted, referring to her digging in, incising the plate, and painted. Some writers have referred to this as her signature, but it is not. It is simply the engraver's inscription of her name. Now, the welcome page is at far left. It bears some faint manuscript beneath the Latin name, showing some evidence of the collector's intervention, the reader's intervention. But because A Curious Herbal was printed serially over a period of about 3 years, each buyer would slowly accumulate groups of pages, which they would eventually collate and take to a binder to be bound into volumes. As I've already noted, one of the owners of the Wellcome copy made some pencil notes of the base of that page. The page from the New York copy, I think, is especially intriguing, though. It's the second from left. Whoever assembled this copy reordered all of the plates alphabetically and put them into one massive volume. They then reserved a much thinner second volume for all of the explanatory pages. But what I think is really intriguing is that the person who did that also tinted the flowers pink, which is very contrary, I think, because Blackwell had pointedly referred to the flowers as white. Now, the third from the left, or the second from the right, is from Merton College, one of 5 copies held by libraries at Oxford. And then the RCP copy is of particular interest because, having been presented to the college by Blackwell herself, it is one that she herself would have colored. So I'm hoping in closing that these images and my narrative begin to convey the sense of how Blackwell worked with other individuals and sourced her visual and verbal information, and shows how it would be displayed in A Curious Herbal. And I apologize for running a little bit longer than I had hoped to, but I thank you very much for your patience and your love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was absolutely fascinating. It's so lovely to see the physical prints and books that you showed in the despite the fact that we're having to do this virtually. It really brought to the materiality of the herbal through all the sort of various the folio-sized copper plates and the various engraved letter forms and so on. I'm aware that we don't have too much time for questions, so I'm going to go straight to some of the questions that come in. So the first one, you're probably aware of this already, but Early English Books Online obviously is a great place to go for accessing the digitized materials that you pointed out. You pointed out that the fact that there were no illustrations in the Dispensary and the Botanica suggests that it was aimed. Those books were aimed at botanists rather than the herbalists. Would you sort of agree with that?
Oh, possibly. That's a good point, and I actually had not thought of it. But on the other hand, both of those books were addressing the medical application of plants. And that really is what distinguishes herbalism from botany, because botany is really the study of plants apart from any application. So it is a bit blurry, though, I think. And I mean, it's just an interesting possibility to contemplate what was going on at that time, where sciences were emerging as objective studies, and their application was being set aside. I mean, it was still considered because there was a real interest in applied science. That was one way that natural philosophers could encourage people to support what they were doing, but at the same time, there's like this odd sort of duality between, yes, let's look at how these are used, but on the other hand, let's just look at these for, this is a plant, just plant qua plant.
Yeah, exactly.
If that makes sense.
It does to me, yes. I'm not sure if this is something or whether the herbal community out there listening to this might know, but at what point did Anonis become the current name Anonis? Is that do you recall when that might have happened, or is that
for
fairly
Anonis,
recent thing?
For Anonis for the rest haro?
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, Anonis, I'm assuming, is the Latin name for rest haro, and I don't know when that was applied to it. No, but clearly it was in use by the early to mid 18th century.
Yeah. Okay, another question. I had thought Alexander Blackwell had helped her with the wording and translations. Do you know, is there any evidence of that?
There isn't really. The earliest reference to him helping her is found in the Gentleman's Magazine, an August, I think it is, issue 1747. It was published shortly after his execution in Sweden, and it does talk about how he had helped her with the wording, and the article was presumably written by someone who knew the Blackwells. It's really so fuzzy, though. I mean, was he actually in debtor's prison? Was he one of those people who was in prison but could go out and walk around and visit his wife and do other things during the day? Did he help her or not? I know that Janet Bright, who presented the Curious Herbal a couple years ago in a slide lecture at the Foundling Museum, noted that there is absolutely no reference to Alexander Blackwell anywhere in A Curious Herbal. And
really?
It gives one pause, I mean, she cited all of these other people, her contemporaries, and thanked them for helping her. And then she cited many other sources of information and so on. And she did not say a word about Alexander. And there could be many reasons for that. I mean, maybe he did help her, but maybe he didn't want to be taking credit. Or maybe she was, maybe by that time his reputation was just so bad that she didn't want to drag him into it. I just don't know.
Yes, exactly. That could have been the case. And another question further to that, where would Elizabeth have learned engraving? Do you think that would have been in the printing office of Alexander, her husband? Even was that a possibility?
No, I don't think so. Alexander was a letterpress printer. There are some pamphlets, booklets that he did actually print, and it is letterpress. Etching was something amateurs could easily learn. If you knew how to draw, you could do etching. Engraving, on the other hand, was a skill that one had to apprentice, learn during an apprenticeship from a master engraver. So I think she just was able to pick up on it because she did know how to draw, clearly. And drawing into wax is not all that much different, I don't imagine, from drawing onto a piece of paper, although I've not tried that.
Sure, exactly. We've actually reached time now, so we have a number of other questions here, but we will make a note of those questions and forward them to you. We can get to and respond to them in due course. It just remains to say thank you so much again for such a fantastic presentation. It's been a delight to have you here. certainly to finish off our season on the 1st of December, Christmas. So it's really just for me to say very happy and safe Christmas to you, Janet, and to all our listeners out there. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, and the same to everyone from me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.